Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We've got a really fabulous lineup. I'm really excited that we're going to be presenting a topic today on defining embodied carbon and pathways for us all to work together on what this idea of embodied carbon is, how we measure it, how we apply it. I think it's going to be a really fabulous conversation. So I'm Claire. I'm the CEO of the SmartCrete Cooperative Research Centre. SmartCrete is a federal Department of Industry cooperative research centre, really helping the concrete sector to reach into the research network across Australia to create pathways towards decarbonisation. And something that we've been really enjoying speaking to the concrete sector about in the last 6 months or so is this idea of the enablers of decarbonisation. And those enablers may not be directly technical in nature, but more like the way that the market itself functions, the way that we define carbon, the way that we measure it, track it, manage risk, and a whole range of other things. And it's been fabulous running this seminar series over about the last 6 months or so, having those deeper conversations about how we work together to accelerate pathways to decarbonisation. We are really pleased at SmartCrete to recognise the ongoing custodianship of the lands on which we meet by Australia's First Nations people. I'm very pleased to pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise specifically the land that I'm joining you here on today, which is the University of Macquarie, which is on Wallumattagal land of the Darug Nation. So I'm pleased to pay respects not only to those elders, but also to the elders of the lands on which you will join us here today as well. I'm also really pleased to say that our conversation today is being brought to you in partnership with MECLA. I'm sure many of you on the line are well aware of the great work that MECLA is doing in order to bring the supply chain together to take those very meaningful actions towards decarbonisation as a shared activity. So it's great to have Evan Smith on the line today, who can tell us a little bit more about the activities of MECLA. We are very keen for this to be a two-way conversation. So please continue to use the chat function. We'd really love to hear from you. But we also have some very specific questions that we'd like to ask you through a program called Menti. So if you've joined us before, you will know how this works. The best option will be, if you have your mobile phone with you, to pull that out and scan the QR code that's on screen at the moment, and that will take you through to our Menti page. Alternatively, you can go to menti.com in your web browser, and you'll need to enter the code 23656050. So we have 4 questions for you today, or really 3 questions. The first one is just asking who you are. And we'd love to get your thoughts on this concept of embodied carbon and how it's being applied in your workplace. But without further ado, let's get into the meaty part of the conversation. So first of all, I am really pleased to introduce to you Evan Smith. Evan is National Sustainability Manager at Wholesome and also co-chair of the MECLA Concrete and Cement Working Group. He, I'm sure, is very well known to many people on the line, has been a fabulous supporter of decarbonisation efforts. He's a seasoned environmental and sustainability professional with over 21 years of diverse experience spanning rail, road, infrastructure, construction and the resources sector. He has a double degree in environmental engineering and environmental technology, very well skilled, and holds the title of Chartered Engineer and is registered in Queensland in the fields of civil and environmental engineering. I can say many, many things about the great influence that Evan has across the sector, but it's been particularly fabulous to watch his work in the EPD space and see his leadership through MECLA. So Evan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Claire. You're gonna make me blush, turn orange like this background. All right, I'll share my screen. 2 seconds. Let's bring this up. That's a great intro. All right, let's jump right into it. I'm just going to do a brief introduction on behalf of the MECLA Concrete and Cement Working Group. So thanks for the invite, Claire. Always keen to be involved in any of these events. Just jumping right into it, I guess the challenge statement that what we're looking at for the sector on the left-hand side is like the CO2 measurements at Cape Grim down in Tasmania. So that graph is like all the current efforts that we're currently doing in relation to reducing embodied carbon, carbon emissions globally as well. So probably a call to action to do more. Under the Paris Accord agreement, that it's estimated that by at least 2030, we have to have at least a 40% reduction in all construction materials, and by 2050 we need to be carbon neutral as well. Just a brief touch on this as well, just to kick it off as well. cement's 11% of concrete overall by weight, but for a standard concrete with no innovation, it's generally 80 to 90% of the embodied carbon of it. It's important to look at this from a life cycle perspective. So then we got the whole picture of like what's going into. So the entire uh, impacts of a material as it comes out of the ground, all the way through the extraction, the processing, the manufacturing, all the inputs that go into it, all the energy and the resources and fuels and electricity that we use to make a product, and then the waste as well. So life cycle assessment covers that as well. And the gold standards is EPDs for quantifying the embodied carbon of construction materials. So just to touch on some of the work that the MECLA Concrete and Cement Working Group has been involved in, we've recently released like a guide to low carbon concrete in Australia, where we decided to have a bit of a crack at kind of furthering the conversation and the knowledge as well. So we had a go at defining what low carbon concrete should be as well. So it's the lowest carbon concrete, but still meeting all technical and performance and durability requirements as well in the guide. We've gone through like an overview of how to ask for low carbon concrete. So how to specify it, ask for EPDs, why is that important, and why to work in embodied carbon rather than percentage of SEM. We've also included some 5 considerations or typical kind of questions that people get, and so also some great links into some other resources as well. So cost, engagement and supply chain, low carbon concrete or actually the low carbon structure, what are we aiming for, where is the project base, and what level of embodied carbon reduction is possible as well. So some great starting information in that guide as well. And then for the final page as well, we had a crack at kind of gathering together all the EPD data for ready mixed concrete in Australia using the EC3 database, to a resource that we had as well. This very much aligns with the data set and the approach taken by NABERS as well. So opening up every EPD for ready mixed concrete in Australia, have a look at what strength it is and what's the embodied carbon on it for that life cycle stages from A1 to A3. So it's everything as it comes out of the ground till it rolls out the gate of the concrete plant as well. And for the first time, it was like, well, what's the maximum embodied carbon for concrete for that strength, or what's the lowest in class as well, and really to help shift that dial as well. And then we looked at different classification systems around the world as well. And we had a look at the ARIC classification, which is what we've used the principle to apply. So F's are like the worst in class covered by an EPD, and then A is 0 is what we're all aiming for by 2050 as well. So some great statistics on where we're currently sitting for the different strengths. This is all for all applications of concrete, all locations throughout Australia as well. We've put it that guys in as well for this as well. So how has it been going since we released that? So we've been getting some really great feedback on the guide. We've actually seen the Australian, the ACT government actually release a low carbon concrete policy. So they've been doing a lot of work in this space as well. And it was great to actually see the MECLA guide referenced in their policy as well, and the proposed approach for phase 1, 2, and 3 as the policy rolls out as well. Hot off the press, I just saw this last night as well. So there was actually an international journal paper looking at the critical review of embodied carbon classification schemes for concrete. So right up my alley as well, and pretty stoked to actually see the MECLA low carbon concrete guide actually referenced in that as well. So keen to kind of go through this in a bit more detail as well. So what are the next steps? And really, we try to highlight in the guide that it's we're aiming for good, not perfect. It's the first alliteration. There's all types of concrete all across Australia as well. And as we know, like it really depends on what application you're using and where you are, depending on what is available and what is low and what's the lowest possible. So the next steps is really to look at location-based data and use an application data as well. So why is this important? Because I think that's the level that we need for companies and projects actually specifying and setting embodied carbon targets for projects. Like we're doing post-tension concrete, what's the lowest available product available in my market, and what's the average, and you can use that then to set specifications and performance targets as well. So with the EPD data set we have really great data on what location it's from, particularly states as well. So got a really good resolution of like where the data is coming from, and then the sub data on that as well. But for application or type, we found is a bit of an issue currently. This is with the available data that we could get for EC3. So 20% of the data set we knew was normal class concrete, so that's strength at 28 days as well. And then the types was really depending on like what was kind of included in the EPD and what company and how they kind of what information they include as well. But there was a big 57% of the EPD data, which really didn't kind of say what's the concrete used for. So you kind of got the data set, but you can't really apply it to that next level as well. So the next step for us is what we're working on is actually some type of uniform classification system that's, that can be potentially adopted by the industry as well. If you're releasing an EPD, include the types of applications that it can be used for as well. So, you're a building project in Sydney, this is what you might be able to is available in the market as well. So yeah, that's really it for me as well. Claire, I'll stop sharing, and yeah, keen to be involved in further discussions as it progresses.
Thanks, Evan. And such great progress there. I think, a couple of years ago, we were still in a position where we didn't necessarily have agreement across the sector on how we define embodied carbon or low carbon concrete. So it's great to see that MECLA has really not only started that conversation, but pushed us a huge way down that path of having some consensus around how we define low carbon concrete. So thank you so much for that. So moving into the question of how we measure and then track that embodied carbon, we're really pleased to have Katie Eyles from NABERS joining us today. Thanks, Katie. So NABERS is looking at the moment, obviously, into embodied carbon ratings tools, and Katie is the sectoral lead for the Accelerating Net Zero Buildings program at NABERS. Her team is developing an embodied carbon ratings tool that will measure, verify, and compare embodied carbon in new buildings and major refurbishments. And a core aspect of that work is collaborating with people across the building industry to ensure that we develop a tool that's trusted, meaningful, and really drives that behavioural change to reduce emissions. So Katie, thank you so much for sharing your progress with us today.
Thank you. Alrighty, let me just share my screen. And switch to presenter mode. Okay. Cool. Shout out if that is not presenting correctly, but I think it is. Thank you. Yeah, so as Claire mentioned, we have recently released the NABERS Embodied Carbon Rating Tool. I'll just start with a little introduction to NABERS, because I think there's a fair chance that probably some of you aren't familiar with what we do. NABERS is Australia's largest sustainability program related to buildings, and we have quite a long history of rating buildings for their operational energy use, water use, waste, indoor environment, and yeah, as of now, embodied carbon. So we rate on this simple 6-star scale, which shows you where you sit compared to the rest of the market. So whether you're market leading with a 6-star building or a kind of average with 3 stars. So yeah, aiming to do this with embodied carbon as well. Oops, sorry, I already covered that. Those are the types of ratings we do. And we're NABERS ratings are fairly common across Australia because for some things they're mandated by legislation. So for example, office energy ratings, if you're over 1,000 square metres, you need to have a NABERS rating to sell or lease your building. So yeah, fairly widespread across Australia. And what we know from having those ratings over time is that measurement leads to improvement. So for example, you can see here for offices and shopping centres, this is for energy use over time, one rating with the NABERS system. By about 10 years into it, they've reduced their emissions with energy use by around 40%. So yeah, really hoping to help people measure and improve with embodied carbon. We started developing the rating tool in 2021 and have spent the last few years working really closely with all the folks around Australia who are involved in developing buildings. So everyone from developers to architects and policymakers and product manufacturers to figure out, okay, if we're going to have a rating scheme for embodied carbon. What do we need to measure? How much of the building are we measuring? What part of the life cycle? What should the rules be about what evidence you need of what was delivered to site? All of those sorts of things. So yeah, probably quite a few of you here have helped us with that consultation process. So yeah, thank you for that. So let's start talking about embodied carbon and why we are benchmarking it. We could, quite easily create something, well, not necessarily easily, but we could create something where we were just measuring, okay, what are your emissions per metre squared of a building, for example, and leave it at that. But without having that star rating scale or only using emissions per metre squared, it's hard to tell, how good you are in terms of reducing emissions. So for example, if you had 2 office buildings that each landed on, 750 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared, how do you know if that's a good result for each of those buildings? Maybe one is low rise, one is high rise, maybe one has underground parking, the other doesn't. Maybe one of them is in, an outer suburb of Melbourne and the other one's in inner city Sydney. Like, how do you know what you should be aiming for in terms of your emissions? That's where having that star rating scale comes in handy. And basically how we create it is we gather data for hundreds of buildings. So for embodied carbon, for about 150 buildings, we have gathered, we've done a full life cycle assessment of those buildings, and we look at what the spread is of the results for different building types in order to understand what we would expect the average emissions to be. So for example, if you're looking at a building that's an office building that's 30 stories high, what would you, based on the data we've collected, what would we expect the average emissions to be for that building type, that building purpose? Then when people rate, we take their result for their building and compare it with what we would expect based on all the data we've collected. And that's how we can place them on that star rating scale from 1 star to 6 star, seeing, how does your result compare with what we would expect typically for that sort of building. In order to do that fair comparison, we take certain things into account. So for embodied carbon, floor area, function, height of building are really important. And we're still going through that benchmarking process. So we're not too sure if there's anything else we need to correct for. But yeah, that's why we benchmark. In terms of what we're measuring with the rating, we're measuring upfront embodied carbon. Of course, there is interest in whole of life as well, but we've focused on upfront because that's what we can measure now. It can be up to about 80% of the embodied carbon throughout a building's life cycle. And that's what we really, the big picture of what we really need to tackle right now. And what we can measure right now is upfront embodied carbon without making, having to go into assumptions about what might happen in the future, which is what would be necessary if we were looking at whole of life. So yeah, focused on upfront embodied carbon. And if we're focused on upfront embodied carbon, how do we measure that for a building? Kind of simple in a way, but complex once you get into the details. We're looking at the quantity of each material times the emissions of that material. And then we add on the transport emissions, construction, energy, and emissions from construction waste. In terms of what materials are included, if we're saying we're measuring the materials that have gone into a building, we're really focusing on capturing about 90% of overall emissions. So that's these main things on the slide here: substructure, superstructure, envelope, some of the bigger internal items such as stairs and floors, ceilings, and then building services and vertical transport. What's not included is things that that are smaller, have less of an impact, fixtures, fittings, fit out materials. And the reason why they're not included is because we need the rating system to be practical and usable. And once we get into too many of those details, it becomes less practical. For some of those details, it's quite hard to find emissions data. It would take a lot longer to gather all the data. So yeah, we're really focused on the bigger picture, capturing the vast majority of emissions, focused on materials that we have data for. What's really important with the rating system is that it's done when the building is complete. So we're focused on as-built data. So what that means is that if you're doing a rating and you have a product with an EPD, so you're using concrete that has an EPD, we really need evidence of what was delivered to site to prove that that product was used in the building. So we're talking things like receipts, delivery dockets, purchase orders, returnable schedules, or other similar things that show us that that is the product that was delivered. In terms of, we've got the quantity of materials, and now we need to know what are the emissions for that material. Like Evan mentioned, yeah, the international standard and what we're focused on is EPDs. Very strong, in our consultation, we found very strong industry preference for EPDs because that data is product specific. If you're a manufacturer that's reducing your emissions, then you have an EPD to prove that you're a lower emissions product. It's rewarding the effort that goes into measuring and reducing. We know, however, that of course not every product has an EPD. So to fill that gap, NABERS created a national emission factors database. So if you have a building that you're doing a rating for and you don't have an EPD or another appropriate source of data, we're also accepting peer-reviewed carbon footprints or climate active product statements that match the international standards that are used for EPDs. If you don't have one of those sources of evidence, then you will have to use the default conservative emission factor that we publish in this database. And just quickly, the way we created that was by collecting all of the EPDs that we could find for products available in Australia. And the conservative default is generally approximately equal to the worst result that we could find in any EPD, plus a little bit of a uncertainty factor. The reason why it's conservative is because we don't want to be rating buildings as better than they are. We want to encourage measurement. We want to encourage people to get EPDs. So yeah, really focused on trying to, really encourage people to use products that have EPDs or another appropriate measurement method, rather than having to use the conservative default factors. Transport and construction emissions, we have default rates for those that we can add on that you can use if you don't have your own data. If you do have your own data, then you can use that as well. But yeah, essentially that's it. Materials, the emission factors for those, and then adding on the transport and construction emissions. In terms of what can be rated, new buildings and partial rebuilds within 2 years of completion. We've got a huge variety of building types that can be rated, from offices and residential things like hotels and apartments through to retail, industrial, and various other types like museums and art galleries and stuff like that. Not all of those will have a star rating scale though, because we couldn't collect enough data to create a star rating scale for every building type. I'm sure you can imagine there's a limited amount of art galleries, for example, that have been built in the last few years that we could use, that we could collect data for. So yeah, some of them we will just certify with their total emissions per metre squared, and other building types that there are more of, like offices and residential and industrial, we can put a star rating scale on for that. In terms of when they can be rated, pilot buildings are in progress now. Some of those will be rated. We're doing training for assessors in February, and so they will have passed their exams and be able to start rating buildings from March. And if you're curious about what's required to go into a rating, what evidence needs to be collected and all that sort of stuff, the rules are out now, published on the NABERS website. So all of the information you need to prepare is there. And yeah, that's it from me. Thank you. I'll pass back to Claire.
Thanks so much, Katie. It's great to see so much progress in this space and great to see the leadership from NABERS there. I think there's that great quote that is often attributed to Peter Drucker: what gets measured gets managed. I'm not actually sure he said that, or at least Google says it wasn't necessarily him, but still, it's such a great example of, if we can measure these things, and you're already seeing that progress. So I'm looking forward to seeing the evolution in embodied carbon measurement for art galleries. We will have to track that one very closely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. So we're going to turn now to Lucy Marsland, who joins us from Atelier 10. We really wanted to get a bit of an example of how this is actually applied in the real world. So it's great to have Lucy with us. Lucy is a senior designer at Atelier 10. She's trained structural engineer and senior designer, advocates for design excellence through creative material use and innovative collaboration. She promotes holistic sustainability by fostering partnerships between architects, engineers, and communities. And Lucy contributes to industry groups, universities, and advancing embodied carbon literacy and life cycle thinking in design across the construction value chain. So Lucy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'll share my screen and crack it if I can. Okay, so yeah, from my role as an environmental designer or sustainability consultant on projects, I'm going to share, I guess, some of the insights and in a way the context of the great work that's happening through MECLA, NABERS, ASBEC, and the like. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot this year is looking beyond measuring, in that the measuring is a one part of the puzzle, but as a sustainability consultant and as anyone who's in the value chain of buildings, there is more. There's things to do before we measure, and there's things to do as we measure. So I'll share some of those ways of working that we do. So normally I'm considered on a project as, the person measuring the carbon or calculating the carbon, and I'm in charge of the upfront carbon on my project. However, in fact, I can never do it alone. And so a big part of my role on projects is in fact to be a facilitator, to do education and to enable collaboration between my discipline designers, my client, as well as our builders and their suppliers down the downstream. So one of the things just to note from my wiggles of arrows is how much there's a two-way conversation, and it's not something we do in a vacuum. So when we're measuring carbon, whether it's for a NABERS rating, for Green Star, or for any other reason, we engage in it early, we engage in it often, and we need to both receive inputs and also feedback inputs so that initiatives are implemented in the design and we have accurate information to measure our building itself. One of the first things I always do on projects and also when teaching with universities or in spaces like this is to focus on education and celebrating best practice and celebrating opportunities to innovate and get creative. And that comes with literacy, and we've seen such huge literacy in carbon, language, shared understanding of concepts grow, and we're also seeing some amazing projects, both within Australia and globally, pushing the boundaries of what's possible and driving down upfront carbon. And it also gets everyone a bit excited, builds the enthusiasm so that we can get into some of the slightly less glamorous components of project work. We always do try and start with a bit of enthusiasm with some nice case studies. So some of the slightly less glamorous bits capture in here, but so important, as I said, that literacy and making sure we're sharing the same language. So part one of that is being able to look at our buildings and share a language, share a understanding, grouping, and conventions of categories that we're focused on. And if you can't do this, in some ways, what you measure, what you calculate, can't be looked at or tracked over time or driven down project to project. Making sure we're comparing apples to apples and consistently understanding, getting to know our buildings really well in terms of their physical scope. I use the RICS naming conventions for this purpose, but it's always a conversation with our cost planners, making sure we're sharing a language with our clients and with our designers so that we are really in dialogue. And then the other part that comes up again and again every time, but we really want to become so ubiquitous that everyone talks about projects in the way of A1 to A3, A1 to A5, and we know in industry at the moment, particularly when we say upfront, as Katie said, upfront embodied A1 to A5 is really picking up more as the standard. However, you will see projects that discuss upfront as A1 to A3, and both are important to be thinking about. So always want to share our language and make sure everyone understands the context. And then we'll also have projects that might go all the way through whole of life. And so also understanding that context is critically important. So we never skip the step of checking that everyone knows their life cycle stages. Now, another bit that I find very glamorous and fun, but depending on your particular, the appeal of spreadsheets or how much of an engineer you are is exciting or not exciting. This is our tracking, and I've picked one example tool of how we can track our projects through their delivery with the Monoro tool that's come out towards the end of last year, a World Green Building Council tool that was developed with Grimshaw in collaboration. I really like it. It really lays out some details, gets into the discipline-specific moves or roles, and gives some simple tools. A big spreadsheet, I know it can be daunting, but it allows us to keep accountable and build carbon to also value decisions and track decision making with our clients and with our design discipline team. So this is the big spreadsheet is where the great dialogue happens often and is documented for the legacy of the project. So I'm a big fan of the big spreadsheet, and I hope others out there are too. And then finally we get to the bit that everyone thinks of, that calculation, the magic where you get to have a quiet day, sit down at your computer with your big bill of quantities and carbon data, EPDs, and start to nut out the numbers. So we do these on our projects. This is one from a project earlier from this year, where you can see the breakdown of where the carbon is sitting in the physical scope of the building, this being a student accommodation building. Plenty of structure, a lot of that sitting with concrete as well as with steel, and then a fair bit in the facade, and interior services also playing their role. And for me, because I'm working on projects that are not just measuring carbon as we've been discussing, we're really trying to drive down the carbon, improve the impact, reduce the impact on our projects. Getting the measurement of the building is one piece, and then driving it down is the second piece. This pathway we'll be moving away in time from the reference approach, but nonetheless, we're still looking to drive down the carbon on our project. So I still think it's an important piece to describe how we're driving down that carbon so that we can share those insights across industry. You can see here that in this case, it was about half and half carbon savings from design optimization and big design decisions, and then procurement, the likes of specifying performance intensities, carbon intensities for different products, including concrete mixes and the like, sitting in that second half in the blue. So that was my speed through a day in the life of a sustainability consultant focused on carbon. You can see there are a fair few big spreadsheets that I thoroughly enjoy, but also a lot of conversations, a lot of education and facilitating dialogue. It's something we do early and often. If we wait till the moment where we have a bill of quantities and we start measuring, the opportunity to drive down the carbon on our projects has often been missed. So it's a bit of a highlight to say that the measuring is one part, and it sits within an ecosystem of dialogue, of tracking, and of I guess sharing a language and sharing an understanding, so that carbon becomes part of the business as usual conversations when we make decisions on projects. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was wonderful to really immerse into your world and see how you're tracking this. And I think what's so brilliant is being able to see the synergies between the way you're tracking carbon and the vision that Katie painted for us in terms of being able to link the global warming potential with those bill of quantity numbers. So really exciting to see the leadership that you guys are really forging ahead with at Atelier 10. Thank you so much. So finally, we're going to now think about what next? Where are we going with all of this? And who better to help us have that conversation than Alison Scott, who's the Executive Director at the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council. So ASBEC are absolutely leading the charge here in terms of coordinating a huge effort to bring together a whole bunch of peak industry associations that are working in this space and help to drive that conversation behind next steps for policy. So let me do a quick introduction. So Alison is Executive Director at ASBEC, which is a body of peak organisations committed to a vision of more sustainable, productive and resilient buildings, communities and cities. Her passion and expertise lie in collaborating with industry, government and third sector leaders to develop national policy and technical solutions that enhance the built environment. And there is no better networker than Alison herself. So over to you, Alison. Tell us, where are we going with embodied carbon?
Thank you, Claire. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you. And I absolutely love it. Lucy, you gave the perfect segue into my presentation because, you know, there's so much fabulous knowledge and expertise in the industry, but how do you get it at scale? You know, and from a NABERS point of view, NABERS has done a fabulous job consulting with industry, developing a really robust tool and measurement process that can be applied consistently, importantly, across infrastructure and buildings. But you know, as you said it, Lucy, what is that policy ecosystem to support that consistent measurement and tool and rating tool? So that's where ASBEC comes in, standing on the shoulders of giants. We were wonderfully funded by the federal government and NABERS to do that ecosystem piece. So in terms of supporting policy, we know that by 2050, if we don't do anything, embodied carbon is absolutely going to be the biggest component of a building's emissions. And not only that, the opportunities, as was mentioned previously, the opportunities for reduction happen mainly at the beginning, because once the building is built, those emissions are effectively locked in, and then you're thinking about all the different fit outs as you go through the life cycle of a building. But you know, a few stats bandied about, that upfront bit is huge. And, you know, around 75–80%, that A1 to A5 component is really important. And, you know, it's what we can do now. We know that we need to look at opportunities across all stages of the life cycle of a building or infrastructure. But really, what we can do now, emissions saved now is worth a lot more in the future. So let's get going on this. So that was the focus of the project that we embarked on. In the middle of the year, we published an issues paper, launched it at the NABERS conference, and that's where we, our wonderful consultants, did an analysis of all the policy out there globally that looks at embodied carbon in some form. And we did a big review, you know, what stages are they looking at? How do they measure? How do they report? What's their process in terms of, you know, signalling, measure, disclosure, and applying sort of reduction targets or budgets or limits. So we had an international study, and then we also, you know, standing on shoulders of giants, we were able to bring in experiences from the processes that we had, that NABERS had when they developed their embodied carbon tool and methodology, the preliminary work of ThinkStep and Green Building Council at the very outset, and then the work that Infrastructure Australia did in their baselining project. All of that stakeholder consultation went into our issues paper, where we established we called them the 7 decarbonisation dilemmas, but in essence, they are both challenges and opportunities, that if we get all of this right, that ecosystem change, the supporting policy ecosystem will really help all this amazing work happening in all parts of the buildings and infrastructure value chain. So that was released, and we had a big consultation, lots of working groups, and heard from the wonderful the huge stakeholder network at MECLA, and that's helped fed into our process. So we know we need to tackle these decarbonisation dilemmas. We know that there's so many initiatives, especially from a MECLA point of view, even within SmartCrete CRC, and then all of the amazing experts out there like Lucy's team, and even in NABERS. But there's so much knowledge out there, and we are continuing to understand how we reduce our embodied emissions. Where industry is very much on the journey, but we know that to really get the scale that we're talking about, we need government intervention. We need government to help us. We also know, talking about targets, I know Evan sort of mentioned a 2030 target of an embodied carbon reduction of 40%. It's a very, very busy graph here, but in essence, let's just say you drew a straight line from today to 2050. By 2035, roughly, you're looking at needing to reduce the embodied carbon of our built environment by around 60 to 70% or 75%. If you actually plot the decarbonisation trajectories of building materials, and these two lines, the black and the grey line, are just indicative. They're taken from global trajectories for concrete, cement, and then the other one is for steel, just indicative. But you see that if we're trying to aim for 60% reduction in 2035, direct material substitution is only going to get us part way there. So looking at Lucy's slide, that's the blue bit of the opportunities for reduction in embodied carbon. So what else is going to get there? That's where we've really, again, wonderfully aligned with what Lucy has been saying, the opportunities right up front. So think about how you procure, think about how you design, the opportunities to really review and revisit about how the built environment uses resources. There's so many opportunities for upfront reductions there. Of course, material substitution with low carbon alternatives is a big part of it, and it's wonderful to see the likes of SmartCrete CRC and MECLA apply those targeted strategies in how to create those low carbon materials that we need. But again, if we look at the A4 and A5 component, we know that there are certain asks that are needed, and that's the fossil fuel free transport and construction processes. So all of these things, they all need to happen. We're talking about something that is systemic. Everything everywhere all at once. So you can't just focus on one at the expense of the other. Right now we can be looking at how we procure better, how we design better, how we make better use of our resources, or how we make decisions about whether we're retrofitting or reusing our structures, how we're adapting our structures. Those things can happen now, but at the same time, we know our supply chain needs to decarbonise. The concrete sector, we know you're working on all of those amazing things to get that clinker as low as possible in terms of emissions output. But we need to set those mechanisms in place now, so that we can get the future benefits. By 2030, we want you to be decarbonised. The built environment wants to signal that we value your low carbon materials. We value you looking at your abatement and how you can get that as low as possible. With that in mind, we realise it is a trajectory. What you need to do now versus what you're doing later will change. And so what we're doing as part of our work is identifying the supporting policy mechanisms that need to kick that into gear. And what we've found in ASBEC is those mechanisms are quite varied. You know, you're talking about the biggest teamwork that you need. So all across the value chain, there's different policy mechanisms that can promote change. You know, one thing with buildings, say for instance, there's the requirement in the National Construction Code, you know, signaling that we are going to be measuring and reporting soon. As soon as we collect the data, we're going to be mandating reductions. But there's all these other mechanisms as well that need to fit into it. What about planning? What about ways to incentivize the supply chain to do more EPDs? Because even from an EPD process point of view, if you're measuring it, if as a manufacturer you're going through the EPD process, you'll be able to understand your processes and potentially reduce more once you understand. So that's what's coming in our big policy roadmap that we hope to release at the beginning of next year. We know that there's a lot that's going into this. We have some really key initiatives that we think as a priority need to work out. So we're working with our stakeholders and working groups to really refine these so that our messages are succinct, wonderfully working with all of you anyway, and hoping that our high level recommendations are able to support your own roadmaps as a sector as you go through your own abatement processes and trying to scale up the low carbon materials that you really need to produce. So really looking forward to continuing to work with you all to get this policy roadmap out there. And that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Alison. I'm really excited to see that progress, and it's great that ASBEC and also MECLA can be used as vehicles to have those very powerful discussions, because we really do need to coordinate across not only the concrete sector, but far more broadly than that. I think it is really interesting seeing that, you know, you're really demonstrating there that this isn't just a materials push. You know, we really also need to be thinking about how those materials are used, which again speaks to the fact that we have to coordinate across the full supply chain. So yeah, thank you so much. Really great insights. We will watch that with great enthusiasm as you develop your policy paper. So that brings us to the end of our presentations, but not to the end of our conversation. We've obviously asked you to complete a series of questions for us using our Menti app, which we might just share that QR code again. You still absolutely have an opportunity to jump in and answer some questions for us. If you have your phone on you, I think that's the easiest way to fill these in rather than trying to use your computer at the same time as using it with Zoom, but completely up to you. So the QR code there will take you straight through to the Menti, or you can go to menti.com and fill in the code 23656050. So now we might open it up to Q&A. We've got about 13 minutes left, and I'd love to give you all an opportunity to dive deeper with our fabulous guests. But before we do that, I might just, we'll show some of the results of those Menti questions just to kick us off, if you've got that in the background there, Natalie. And I also encourage you to pop any questions that you have additionally into the chat. Perhaps if we go over to the next question, Natalie. Great. So our first question was, how confident are you in terms of embodied carbon? You know, in terms of understanding what it is, how it's measured, and what your role is. And it's so great to see that everyone feels quite confident. That's really good. Hopefully we're having enough of these discussions as a sector that we really know now what we're talking about and how to apply those principles. If we move on to the next question. A few people online have done gone through the process of creating an environmental product declaration or an EPD. Great to see that changing as we go. And a number of people have not, or it's not part of your role. Oh, great to see someone has one in progress. And then I think we had one more question if we shift over. Yeah, so what's next? So this one's going to be a little bit hard to summarize, but we'll scroll through a couple of those answers. It's great to see skills on there. Absolutely something we have to keep focusing on. field trials, yeah, just that engagement. Great to see a couple of PhD students on the line. Thank you for joining us. You know, you are our next generation, so we definitely want to include you in these conversations. So I might ask all of the panelists if you want to join me back on the call. We're now available to have more of a conversation. I can see we've got a question already here from Daniel, so I'll start there. Do these strategies take into account the ease of access of public transport at adequate cycling infrastructure? That is a really fascinating question. Alison, you've got some thoughts?
Yeah, happy to feel that. And I love it because as we've been going through the ASBEC journey, initially we started our project with a buildings focus because that's where NABERS works. But, you know, we share the same supply chain across buildings and infrastructure, and there's a blurred line anyway. You know, from a National Construction Code point of view, it talks about schools and hospitals, but more often than not, you know, from a government procurement point of view, they're the ones delivering a lot of hospitals and schools. So we need to ensure that the policy for buildings and infrastructure are aligned. Very long way of saying, Infrastructure New South Wales released a report last year, a really fantastic report around decarbonising infrastructure delivery. And there's a whole concept, you know, it employs a lot of the PAS 2080 concepts in there, and it's around the whole avoid question. So avoid is looking exactly what Daniel mentions in terms of, you know, do I actually need to build this structure? You know, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? And what is actually the lowest carbon option in that regard? And it might not be, you know, potentially building more roads and, you know, building more infrastructure spread out. Is it infill? Is it, you know, building up communities? Is it applying more sensitive urban design principles to achieve a better result? So it's very complex, and it requires, again, that systemic view on things. So the decisions you make at the concept stage are so important. And yeah, cycling and public transport as lower carbon alternatives to encouraging car use, that's a big one.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alison. And such a great call to that idea of continuously thinking back to the life cycle of carbon and the way that that infrastructure is used. So that was a brilliant question. Thanks, Daniel. Lucy, I have a question for you. As we're starting to think about full supply chain engagement in these pathways forward, you know, I think a lot of the time we can have these conversations and it quite often feels like it's the same people in the room all the time, and we're all very passionate and excited about this. I'd love to hear from you if you're seeing a real shift in terms of client engagement and whether those clients are really starting to proactively ask for more sustainable solutions.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we see more engagement both upstream and downstream of the engineers and designers that may be the first port of call often. From a client perspective, I think we absolutely are seeing it with dual kind of carrots and sticks. The finance sector moving into engagement with green financing is bringing upfront carbon into the brief of more projects that I work on, because our clients or the developers are getting their financing with those kind of as carrots for bringing upfront carbon into the conversation. And then also we're seeing municipal governments, city councils bringing in their planning policies that embed normally through Green Start or through the New South Wales SEP upfront carbon into the conversation as a planning requirement. So I think, yeah, for our clients, it's very much part of the mix, and they are becoming very literate in the language and the concepts very quickly, which is great to see.
That is fantastic. That's very, very encouraging. Michael, great to see you online. Fantastic question as well that I immediately have thoughts about, and I'm sure the panel have thoughts about as well. So government direction in terms of the need for reduction in embodied carbon is very closely linked to market demand, but will only work effectively if it puts a cost on carbon. How do we all feel about this? What are the panel's views? Evan, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts?
Yeah, I guess the cost of carbon kind of is like relating back to life cycle assessment, first step, you've got to kind of quantify what the embodied carbon of it is. And then the cost of carbon is just like a way of kind of valuing that. I think it's very important that we need to kind of move from traditional procurement models. It's like tick all the boxes and give us the cheapest material possible, because the future is what happens if it's 2% more, but it's 20% lower? How does your procurement model set that up? So I guess the cost of carbon can be like a way to kind of factor that all in and bring it back down to the dollar number that we're all kind of familiar with kind of working. But we need to look at the procurement models and also the way we set procurement models up as well to value decarbonisation as well, or maybe even moving from, you know, construct only projects to design and construct. But we also know that, you know, large percentage of reductions can be done in the design phase as well. So we also have to kind of radically kind of think about the opportunities for innovation, how we do that. I think it all starts up front for the tender and the procurement. So I think that's very important as well.
Yeah, totally agree. If I can throw my 2 cents in here, because why not? I think that the government has a real role to play in terms of driving those market signals. When we think about how capital intensive this sector is, and the investment that's required upfront in order to produce some of these lower carbon products, we really need that certainty of market demand to be there. And I think government has a really important role to play in driving that market demand through some kind of pricing mechanism. So yeah, I'm certainly in full support. Alison, your thoughts?
Thanks, Claire. When I stop speaking, I will go on the internet and find the link for you. But Infrastructure Australia has set some carbon values over a series of years based on their current capacity or the projects, the projections in their portfolio. So I will send them out. I know that Transport for New South Wales has also got prices in their procurement considerations. So it's happening. I think it's only a matter of time before those values are aligned across the country. I think that's so. Yeah, it's exciting. It's happening.
It is, yeah, absolutely. And there's some great leadership, as you say, from businesses that are driving those carbon prices internally for their decision making. I think Siemens is perhaps a good example there, where no internal procurement decision is made without adding the cost of carbon into that decision, which at least at an internal level drives their decision making, which I think is a fabulous example. Jeff, timber is often trumped as a carbon negative, carbon sink, and a heroic means to remove carbon from the equation. What about accounting for its eventual decay and release back into the cycle? At least concrete is an inert, I suppose the way to carbon is locked up for good. Who feels like addressing timber? Katie?
Yeah, so for the NABERS rating, biogenic carbon is not considered in your actual rating or measuring emissions. It is reported separately. So if you're using timber, you can see what the biogenic number is, but it's not actually part of the STAR rating. We spent a lot of time working on that with concrete folk, timber folk, steel folk, manufacturers across the board to kind of land on that agreement where everyone was happy with that.
Yeah, thank you. And I would say also there's so much more work that needs to be done in terms of the evolution of our carbon measurement systems, which is fantastic to see all the leadership from NABERS and others in that space. So great to see that we're going to continue that conversation. So a couple of questions are coming through the Q&A, so I'll just quickly swap over there. Thanks, Beatty and Alison, also for sharing that link. Okay, so first question. Question around education and advocacy. Within the climate and sustainability sector, most would understand how embodied carbon emissions can impact on climate change. However, for stakeholders and members of the public who are not familiar with the concept of the circular economy and sustainability, how would you recommend approaching the question around, well, the building will be built and carbon emissions will be locked in and won't be released into the environment anymore anyway, so why should we care about embodied carbon? Yeah, which is a really interesting take. Evan, do you want to give us some thoughts?
I guess the mega trends are showing population are increasing. So I think there's like 8 billion to 10 billion people. The estimate to there's going to be the size of New York City built every month for that increase in population. So I think seen some stats as well, like 60% of the buildings in 2050 haven't been built yet. So I guess upfront carbon emissions happen when the building gets built, so then you can't do anything about it. So we know all those buildings are going to be built between now and 2050, and it's opportunity to kind of reduce them if we need to as much as possible, because once it's built you can't go backwards. We have solutions for operational energy, but upfront carbon emissions are typically like more hard to abate sector, so we need to start working on it now to accelerate it.
Yeah, thank you. So we have just about a minute left and we have one more question, so perfect timing. And great to see you online, CJ. So once ASBEC's policy paper is released, what are the pathways to to move that into implementation, and how can those pathways be strengthened or streamlined? Great question. Alison.
Thank you. So the exciting thing about this work is that we're looking at how these recommendations not only complement the pathways that you have as a sector. So, we want to be strengthening what you need to do as a concrete and cement sector, but we will also, it will use it in our advocacy and engagement with the relevant governments. So, for instance, the building ministers will be making decisions on using NABERS as a voluntary pathway for commercial buildings in NCC 2025. We will continue our work recommending to building ministers that, beyond 2025, okay, what needs to happen for NCC 2028 when, we've got signalling, we need to do measurement and reporting. Once we've got enough solid data to get some benchmarks, then we can start thinking about targets and reduction targets or potentially budgets. So that's the process with the NCC. We know that from a infrastructure perspective, you've got the infrastructure transport ministers meeting. They've all agreed on that similar approach, and wonderfully it's all aligned with the NABERS methodology. So you'll see rolling out across buildings and infrastructure consistency in the way we're measuring, hopefully a shared data platform that is continually maintained and updated. And we will be working again with our, say, transport and infrastructure government stakeholders across the country to ensure that we get the benefits of consistency, we get the benefits of scale. So it will be happening. We won't set and forget, though. We know that there's a lot more that we need to do, and there's a lot we don't know yet. And once these things start happening, we'll know where we need to push next or what the next steps are in terms of policy.
Yeah, brilliant. Exciting space to be participating in and watching as progression continues. So we have reached the end of our session. This has been a really fabulous discussion. Can I thank very deeply the MECLA community for supporting this presentation, and also fabulous to have all of our presenters join us. Thank you so much to Evan, Katie, Lucy, Alison. It's been wonderful to hear your insights today, and thank you so much to everyone online for joining us for this call. See you next time.